Good evening, everyone. My name is Kimberly, and I will be doing my topic on the Chernobyl disaster. Um, the title of my project is The Children of Chernobyl, and my thesis statement is examining exposure to irradiated food contamination and incidences of thyroid cancer in children. So my title slide has a picture of a man and a boy in the background, and both of them are suffering from thyroid cancer. So, and they're receiving care at a hospital in the Ukraine where these types of surgeries are performed daily. Um, the man was a liquidator at the time of the accident, and I'll explain to you what liquidators or who liquidators are. And of course, the overall theme of my project is thyroid cancer in children, and this boy is one of those patients who are suffering from thyroid cancer. So the sort of order of my discussion is going to be on, what happened um, at the what caused the disaster, rather, the immediate effects, the contamination, how it was spread, what emergency prevention strategies were there or implemented, the impact on the environment, irradiated food sources, the impact on human health, and talk some more about thyroid cancer, and then of course, um, discuss my final thoughts and conclude my project. So, of course, first of all, let's talk about nuclear power plants and what those are. So, nuclear power plants use heat generated from nuclear fission to convert water into steam, which then powers generators to give electricity. They do not produce greenhouse gas emissions. They are a clean air source of energy. Radioactive materials are often formed from this process and are stored elsewhere. Now, what happened at Chernobyl in particular was that one of the reactors, they were doing a power test, and one of the reactors malfunctioned and exploded at the station. And as a result, the accident released enormous amounts of radioactive material into the environment and has been defined as one of the most horrendous and catastrophic nuclear disasters in history. So to stop the fires, first responders used sand, and to prevent further reactions of the reactor, they used boron and other materials to sort of neutralize the situation. In the following weeks and months after the disaster, a structure called the sarcophagus was built to prevent further release of materials into the environment. On this slide that I am looking at right now shows a picture of the aftermath of the disaster, and I think I can include in here a picture of how they built the sarcophagus over the 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 impact zone, rather. According to the World Health Organization, large amounts of cesium and iodine 131 were released into the air, and the impact of the blast released, as I said before, radioactive materials into the atmosphere, contaminating neighboring countries such as Belarus, the Russian Federation, and other places in Europe. So, the immediate impact of the accident, reports state that two staff members and five firefighters involved in firefighter actions were killed. Firefighting actions were killed. 237 firefighters and Chernobyl power nuclear power plant employees were examined for acute radiation sickness. Varying degrees of severity were found in at least 134 individuals, resulting in 13 bone marrow transplants. The severe radiation effects subsequently killed 28 of 600 workers within 4 months after the accident, and then this number increased by 19 by 2004. Persons living around the area were evacuated. This totaled about 115,000 people were evacuated from heavily contaminated areas in 1986, and then another 220,000 people were evacuated in subsequent years. So they have categorized three groups who were exposed to different levels of radiation. The liquidators, and I mentioned to you before the guy in the picture that's on my title slide, he was one of those liquidators. And a liquidator, actually that term was coined specifically for the role these workers played in the cleanup efforts and recovery operation after the accident. So the liquidators, of course, were exposed to very, very, very high levels of radiation, and then the evacuated residents were also exposed to some level of radiation, and then the general population, which totaled to be about 5 million people from neighboring countries or provinces within the Soviet Union and other parts of Europe who were exposed to levels of radiation at the time. So on my next slide, I'm talking about the contamination. So the level of exposure, the plume from the blast created. The plume created after the blast moving with prevailing winds across neighboring provinces and other countries. Heavily contaminated areas were Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. They give a measurement here of 37K becquerel meters. I'm not so sure how that translates in math, but it was very high. Other countries such as Finland, Sweden, Norway, Austria, and Bulgaria received equivalent levels of exposure. Dynamic meteorologic conditions, including temperature, wind, cloudiness, temperature, humidity, and varying physiochemical particles, define patterns of ground contamination. Levels of contamination could be detected as far as up to 3,000 kilometers from the from the nuclear power plant. That's very far. So, as I sort of mentioned from what I just said before, mechanisms of contamination were, of course, wind that assisted the plumes to disperse out into the atmosphere. Also, they experienced heavy rainfall, which aided in ground contamination and contamination of water sources. Now, I have a picture here in this slide, and I'm guessing that these contaminated areas, especially near the nuclear power plant, are opened for tourism because there's a picture here with a tour guide with some device that's monitoring the radiation levels, which is showing 37.3, and that is higher than normal. The caption says, and in the background is the nuclear power plant and a woman taking a picture. Now, in the next slide shows the patterns of the plumes and how it was dispersed, how the contamination was dispersed over these areas in Europe. All right, and it shows the day, the time, and it numbers each plume that they calculated for each corresponding date of the radioactive fallout. Now, on the next slide here, I'm talking about emergency prevention strategies at that time. So, after the blast, as I mentioned before, at least 15,000 tons of sand and other materials were dumped onto the site where the blast occurred to help out the fires and reduce any further or prevent any further radioactive reactions. And then, of course, weeks and months after, they constructed a sarcophagus to contain the other material and prevent more radioactive material from being dispersed in the atmosphere. Now, one of the things I found interesting was that immediately after the accident, there is no equipment to measure the level of radiation. So, immediately after the blast, no one knew how high the level of radiation was, how high the level of exposure of these radioactive materials were. And so, in addition to that, there was no protective gear. So, a lot of these firefighters, were the ones who suffered acute radiation sickness because they did not have the proper gear to reduce their exposure to the radioactive material. Of course, officials, when they realized the severity of the accident, they created an exclusion zone and evacuated their residents, as I had mentioned to you before, as a prevention strategy. Sorry. Another thing that they did was distribute potassium iodide as a prophylaxis to reduce radiation poisoning. But one of the issues was that a lot of people did not receive the potassium iodide. A lot of people reported not receiving that potassium iodide from local officials. So other issues that affected prevention strategies or a lack thereof was that it seemed that there was poor preparation for a large scale disaster. There is lack of information from the authorities, and apprehension, for dispersing this info or disseminating this information to individuals because of fear of a widespread panic. Now, most of the emergency prevention strategies, are effective, and some of them, if it was done properly, for example, the distribution of the potassium iodide pills, it could have helped reduce the exposure. So another thing that was an issue was the fact that a lot of people weren't properly informed about the risks of exposure. And another issue that complicated matters was that resources were very limited. If safety measures such as the widespread distribution of the iodide pills, as I mentioned before, were delivered swiftly, severe health consequences like thyroid cancer would have been avoided. Now, on this side in particular, there is a picture of a nurse in Warsaw, Poland, who is administering an iodide solution to a 3-year-old as one of the protective measures taken for possible radiation poisoning at the time. So moving on to the next slide. So overall impact on human health. Now, this is what I found, shocking, because when I found out about this disaster, it seemed to me that the health consequences were very severe. However, data suggests, and here I report this in my project, is that available data does not suggest the radiation exposure from the disaster contributed to an increased risk of leukemia and other forms of cancer. Also, available evidence does not suggest that the disaster is linked with adverse pregnancy health outcomes, delivery complications, stillbirths, or other health conditions in families. However, the disaster did have some impact and increase psychological disorders such as depression. And one of the issues that further exacerbated this problem was, fears, misinformation, mistrust, because the government at the time was radio silent about the incident. So many people did not know or understand what was going on. They saw things that were really out of place and they heard stuff, but rumors combined with fears just made matters worse. So, just to summarize those points, a lot of the reports of the health consequences people claim were exaggerated. But one of the associations that they made was the incidence of thyroid cancer in children was one of the consequences of the disaster. They've proven that, and that is the focus of my project. So the impact on the environment. So one of the articles that I read stated that initial ionizing radiation exposure contained particles 131 iodine, and later phases of the environmental contamination and exposure entailed cesium and strontium. Immediately after fallout, radioactive iodine was of concern but has a short half-life. Exposure to cesium rather than iodine was thought to be more important at the time, given that cesium had a longer half-life. So I'm guessing their thought process at the time was iodine has a shorter half-life, so that means it's not going to stay in the environment for very long, but cesium has a longer half-life, so it will stay in the environment for a significant period of time. Cesium radionuclides have a much longer half-life and affects the environment in two ways. So topically, it deposits on plants, and it can be absorbed through the roots of vegetation. Now, persons living in forested areas of contaminated areas, of course, received higher doses of ionizing radiation from food sources such as mushrooms, wild berries, which tend to absorb high concentrations of nuclides. And of course, this leads into my next slide, which I'm going to talk about the irradiation of these other food sources. Now, I didn't focus on, any particular mutations in wildlife or other animals and that sort of thing, but it would be interesting to see if there is any incidences of mutations in the wildlife or any changes in the ecosystem as a result of the disaster. But one thing for sure is that the food sources were contaminated, as we are learning now that they can absorb these high concentrations of radionuclides. Now, radionuclides contaminated a number of food sources, including milk, vegetables, grains, meat, and wild berries and mushrooms, which is a part of the diet of these people in these areas. Iodine is found in a higher concentration in children because of their intake of milk, as it is an integral part of their diet. Milk is the main route for iodine isotopes, and many children drank milk contaminated with radioactive iodine. So aside from external exposures, consuming milk at that time that was already contaminated with iodine was one of the reasons or one of the ways that increased the risk of thyroid cancer. So in other places, the contamination also affected their food sources. So I give some examples. For example, for example, in places like Finland, their milk, beef, pork, the Baltic Sea area, Baltic fish and other game species had some level of radionuclides. Wheat from Croatia, Great Britain, milk, their sheep had high levels of radionuclide contamination. Food exported from these countries, as from the aforementioned, had to be either returned or destroyed due to high levels of radiation. Now, the same article that I found this information from talked about how the US found out about the disaster sometime after and started monitoring the food sources that were coming into the country. And apparently, this was classified information, which was later released. But there are 15 occasions where they had to destroy imported goods from these areas due to the high radiation levels. Now, thyroid cancer. So, the increasing incidence of thyroid cancer in children was met with great skepticism because of the latency period. Another issue or another reason why people were hesitant to make the connection with the disaster and the incidences of thyroid cancer was because of the lack of proper data collected before the disaster. This area is endemic to goiter, and that this is a factor that also increased the risk of thyroid cancer. Now, the thyroid is the only tissue in the body that takes and stores iodine. And so the form of thyroid cancer that was most prevalent at that time was the papillary thyroid cancer. And I have a picture showing why they name it that type of cancer. Is because there are these papillaries that are formed from the cells, basically. So, some of my articles explain that papillary thyroid cancer is usually associated with tyrosine kinase genes and RET rearrangements, and due to radiation exposure and point BRAF oncogene mutations. So that is sort of like a taste of the in-depth biology of how thyroid cancer is formed in the body. So I read an article that captures data from on thyroid cancer from the Institute of Endocrinology in Ukraine. Within 4 years of the accident, an increasing number of children and adolescents from contaminated areas developed thyroid cancer. Children living near Chernobyl were more likely to develop thyroid cancer compared to children living in less exposed areas. And we all understand that, of course, these children were exposed to high doses of radiation. So it's no surprise that they're more susceptible to developing thyroid cancer as a result. So the authors of this article, sort of work through the amount of cases that were developing within a 5-year period after the disaster. So they begin first with talking about the number of cases before Chernobyl. So between 1981 and 1985, there were 25 cases registered at the Institute. After the disaster from 1986 to 1990, there were 60 patients who were operated on at the Institute. From 1990 to 1995, there were 206 thyroid cancer cases. And from 1996 to 1998, there were 132 thyroid cancer cases in children at that time. Over 4,000 cases of thyroid cancers who were under 18 were found, who were under 18 at the time of exposure. So then I think there more from this particular study or information from the Institute. A total of 330 children, that's less than 14 years of age, and adolescents between 15 and 18 years, sorry, were operated on after the Chernobyl accident. Children less than 8 years at the time of the accident accounted for 278 of the patients who developed thyroid cancer. And researchers have found that children who are less than 8 years are more susceptible and sensitive to cancerogenic action of radiation. Thus, persons who were at a young age at the time of exposure and exposed to severe amounts of radiation were at increased risk of developing thyroid cancer. So, some of the symptoms and clinical manifestations the same article talked about was in the neck, a thyroid mass, cervical lymphadenopathy, pulmonary mastosis, and other uncommon symptoms were coughing, hoarseness, difficulty breathing, and swallowing, and pain in the thyroid gland. And some methods of treatment were thyroidectomy, and patients also received suppressive or hormonal replacement therapies. What's next? So another cohort study invited 32,385 persons who were younger than 18 years old at the time of the accident to be screened for thyroid pathology. However, only 13,127 persons, were actually screened. Estimates of doses were accounted for based on radioactivity measurements after the accident and excess relative risk, which refers to the excess rate of occurrence of a particular health effect associated with the exposure to radiation, were calculated using per gray. So this is another thing I should mention that was difficult for me to sort of understand was the different measurements of radiation exposure. Some places, some articles talk about the becquerels, some talk about gray, some talk about REM. I hope to clarify, the measurements in my paper. But for right now, I'll mention them, but I won't go into detail about these actual measurements that they use because each article and each author used some different measurement. So excess relative risk was calculated per gray, accounting for individual doses and a linear excessive relative risk model. So the results of this study: 45 pathological confirmed cases were identified in 1998 and 2000 screening. Thyroid cancer showed a strong relationship with individual thyroid dose estimate, giving an excess relative risk of 5.25. That sounds pretty high. I don't know if persons in our class has done epidemiology, but that's high. That's very high. Though not statistically significant, the older you were at exposure was associated with decreased risk of radiation related to thyroid cancer. And so to conclude their study, they found that exposed children or adolescents to radiation at the time of the disaster was strongly associated with an increased risk of thyroid cancer. All right, so I'm hoping that you're getting a sense of what factors or what variables create this association with the development of thyroid cancer in children. And so this table here, I've highlighted some of the important variables. Age and sex had a statistically significant association with thyroid cancer, and females had twice the risk than males of developing thyroid cancer at the time. So you can see in the column with the p-value that these variables are statistically significant, or these findings were statistically significant. And if you understand the concept of odds ratio, you see how high some of these odd ratios are as well. So in my next slide, that graph there is depicting a dose response relationship. So as you can see on the y-axis, I hope I'm not making, yes, the y-axis is the odds ratio and the x-axis is the dose per gram. And as the odd ratios increase, meaning the how high your odds of exposure are, the dose also increases. So the relationship between thyroid dose and risk of thyroid cancer in Chernobyl population exposed at younger 18 younger than 18 years of age. The study has shown a positive and linear relationship between thyroid dose from radioactive iodines and subsequent thyroid cancer risk, with an excessive relative risk of 5.25 grays. So that, in a nutshell, is what that graph is depicting. So, conclusions. Considering weight and metabolism differences, a child's radiation exposure, or a child who is exposed to radiation is higher than adults. So, radiation exposure is attributed to or has increased the risk of thyroid cancers in children. A major source of contamination was drinking milk. Incidence of thyroid cancers could have been significantly reduced. Again, I'm going back to the distribution or the lack of distribution of the potassium iodide pills, the inadequate information about what was going on at the time also increased the risk of thyroid cancers in children. Another thing that some of the articles that I went through mentioned was the nuclear power plant employees were unaware of some of the design flaws of the reactors, and this too is the fault of the Soviet Union government at the time, which was shrouded in secrecy about many things. And I won't go into details about that, but that is one of the issues. Aside from human error, there were design flaws of the reactor that caused it to malfunction and caused that disaster. Um, Officials and government personnel were very much unprepared for a disaster of that magnitude. And so that is the reason why there are so many, widespread issues about the disaster. Um, Another thing too is that the world is still learning from the impact of the Chernobyl disaster. There's still ongoing studies. Many persons are restarting studies to read with the new technology that we have to monitor the effects of the disaster. Um, One article mentioned that the amount of radioactive material that was released from the disaster is estimated to last in the environment for up to 3,000 years. So scientists, who have a vested interest in understanding the level of contamination, are interested in studying this disaster and its effects closely. So my final thoughts and future recommendations. Now, having read more about the nuclear power energy, nuclear power plants, I'm wondering if we really need them. Is it a case that we can't find alternative sources of energy? Do we really need to are we so pressed that we have to use these sources that can have detrimental effects if not handled properly? another recommendation or thought that I had was, scientists and researchers, should do more research on the health impact to determine you know, if really and truly there aren't any more associations with this disaster, and health consequences particular to those areas that were highly exposed. I think officials should also continue to monitor radiation levels in these food sources and, carefully watch what is happening in their population and how consuming foods from these environments are affecting persons. So, another thing that was a big issue with this disaster was that people were not adequately prepared. And it is my hope that nuclear power plants have learned to prepare for these disasters and that they adequately inform, their residents that live in close proximity about the necessary precautions that they need to take in case of an emergency. So that's the end of my project. Of course, not the end of my project, but those are my final thoughts. Let me know what you think. Please ask questions. Let me know your concerns. If you have any suggestions or ideas that I could, use to make this paper better, that would be very helpful. This topic I find very intriguing and interesting. The Chernobyl disaster is a very mystifying and fascinating occurrence of our time, and there is no other situation like it. Even though you had Fukushima, you had the nuclear atom bomb situation in Japan during World War II. Chernobyl is truly unique in its phenomenon. I mean, and I hope there's no other situation like it in time to come. But I hope a lot of in the development of nuclear power plant and nuclear energy, that we understand what we are trading when we choose to use this source of clean energy, and not think about the impact it would have if it's mismanaged. So thank you for listening. I know this video is pretty long. It was very hard to do, but I just want to thank Professor Dheeraj for giving me this opportunity to explore this topic some more. And I hope you guys will learn something and be more enlightened about this issue. And I'm looking forward to seeing your videos as well. So thank you for listening, and thank you for looking at my slides.